Hello BookTube. For this Tag Tuesday, I'm going to be doing the V tag, created by Jim of Jim's Books, Reading and Stuff. This is the latest in his continuing alphabet tag series. V is for vampire. What is your favorite vampire book? I really don't have one. To be honest, I don't think I've ever really read that many vampire books. I know for sure I've read The Vampire Armand and Queen of the Damned by Anne Rice, which there's a scene in The Vampire Armand I rather like, but beyond that, I don't think I would necessarily like either book. Although it has been well over 20 years since I've read both, because I was like a sophomore or junior in high school, and I checked them out from my local library. And I think I've read, and I don't know if I've dipped into Children of Night by Dan Simmons, which I think is about vampires in a more science fictional context than horror or fantasy, but I never really dipped more than maybe a chapter in. I've never read Dracula, although I have seen a number of adaptations, my favorite being the film version with Gary Oldman, Winona Ryder, and Keanu Reeves. Although, what the hell they were thinking casting Keanu Reeves, I have no clue. But anyway, so I don't really have a favorite vampire book. So I'm going to kind of twist this prompt into who's your favorite vampire? And for that, I'm going to go with Selene. Selene is a long-running villain of the X-Men in Marvel Comics. She is a 17,000-year-old immortal mutant psychic vampire. So a psychic vampire is a vampire that drains the life force of their victims rather than drains their blood. So Selene can take a portion of her victim's soul to sort of enslave them, and she can also turn them into psychic vampires like herself, although these creations I think tend to look more like classic vampires than she does, with a more monstrous version of vampires. Or she can drain them completely and reduce them to dust. She's also a moderately powered telepath, although nowhere near the level of Professor Xavier or Jean Grey or even Emma Frost. She can also telekinetically control, I think it's inorganic objects. And she's also a sorceress of some power, although how much is dependent on plot. She first appeared in The New Mutants, before moving on to the X-Men comics as the Black Queen of the Hellfire Club, which she served on for a number of years before she was sort of removed alongside most of the rest of the club, or the inner circle at the time, in the early 90s, and then during that time she was mostly independent when she appeared, before finally in the late 2000s, early 2010s, finally getting her own big bad status, her own crossover event in which she was the main antagonist, in which she resurrected a number of mutants, I think like millions of mutants, who'd been killed in the Genosha massacre a few years earlier, and then she absorbed their life force to become a god, and then promptly lost it a few minutes later, and then she was later resurrected, and then most recently appeared in some capacity in more recent X-Men comics, as well as Ta-Nehisi Coates' run on Captain America. So anyway, a quick overview of Selene, who is actually also one of my favorite supervillains. V is for vintage classics. What is the last vintage classic you read? I have no clue. I don't even think I've heard of them until this prompt. I mean, I forgot to look to research them. V is for Villa Pacifica. What is the last book you read beginning with V? Victoria the Queen by Julia Baird. Which, if you watched my last weekly reads video, you would know I was intending on reading this book next weekend. Yeah, this weekend's fiction reading was crap, and I will rant about it on weekly reads. But suffice it to say, as far as Victoria the Queen is concerned, this book is fantastic. I loved it, and I'm looking forward to raving about it and discussing it Friday when I do my weekly reads video. Suffice it to say, I want a lot more Victorian biographies, as well as pre-Victoria biographies, and English royal biographies, and British Prime Minister biographies. I just want a lot of biographies. V is for violence. What is the most violent book you've read? Given the fact that I read science fiction and fantasy, there is a lot of violence in them. Whether the violence is decently analyzed, engaged with, thought about, is one matter. I mean, it's very often the large body counts are kind of glossed over. One of my issues with, say, Dune Messiah by Frank Herbert is that in one of Paul's more self-pitying moments, he mentions the fact that he is responsible for the deaths of 60 billion people. And that is never really adequately addressed. It's just, yeah. And that is not uncommon, frustratingly. But I would think probably the most violent books I've ever read would be probably grimdark fantasy. So, say for example, The Darkness That Comes Before by R. Scott Baker, A Storm of Swords by George R. Martin, I would think is whether has it shot at being one of the most violent books I've ever read. Who else? The Mirror Empire by Cameron Hurley. Also, The Stars Are Legion, I think, might have a good argument for being the most violent book I've ever read. So I'll try to leave a few in the show notes. Again, assuming I remember them, because these are off the top of my head. But I would say pretty much the most violent books I've ever read have been grimdark fantasy. V is for video. Which is your favorite of these alphabet videos? I've actually liked them all. Even the ones that don't necessarily have prompts that necessarily work for me. But I mean, I've enjoyed all of them, and I've enjoyed doing all of them. V is for The Vanishing Half. Have you read it? No, I haven't. Um, V is for Vermeer and VanGogh. Whose paintings do you prefer? So, initially I was going to say Van Gogh on the strength of Starry Night. But this morning I went and looked them both up on their Wikipedia pages and looked at some of the paintings that are on there. And the more I thought about it, the more I have to go with Vermeer. I think that Vermeer is technically a much better painter, certainly if you value a more realistic look. His portraiture is head and shoulders superior to Van Gogh's. And I would say his landscapes and cityscapes are equally better. There's a flatness. Well, I think Van Gogh's colors are incredibly rich and vibrant. There's a flatness to them that I think Vermeer certainly doesn't have. It's So I'm going to go with Vermeer over Van Gogh, even though I do generally like the Impressionists quite a bit. V is for many places: Venezuela, Venice, Vienna, Vanuatu, Victoria, Vancouver, Vermont, and Virginia. Have you read a book from a place beginning with V? Yes, quite a few. I've read, obviously, The Vampire Armand by Anne Rice does take place in part in Venice. There's also a novel by Jeanette Winterson that I am blanking on that takes place in Venice. Also, Faces Underwater by Kenneth Lee takes place in a version of Venice. I've read a few histories on Venice, and I want more. I do want a big history of Venice. So Vienna, I've read, obviously, The Habsburg Empire by Peter Judson, which obviously would feature Vienna in part. And Victoria, I've read A History of Australia by Frank Welsh, which would cover that. Vancouver, I'm not entirely sure. And Vermont and Virginia, I think I've read less than zero. Rules of Attraction, I think in part takes place in Vermont. And I would say Secret History by Donna Tartt should also take place in Vermont. Or, if not actually taking place in Vermont, are inspired by Vermont, because I think the college that Bret Easton Ellis and Donna Tartt both went to, I think, is in Vermont. But I could be wrong. But I think it is. In Virginia, I can't think of one off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure I have, but it's not coming to me immediately. V is for Vulture. Have you seen a vulture? In the wild, no. I have seen like vultures or buzzards flying around when I've gone on like car trips. I've also, I'm pretty sure, have seen vultures at the Cameron Park Zoo in Waco. I've only gone once, and that was when me and my mom took Famine and Pestilence, the older two of the 4 children of the apocalypse, my 2 nieces and 2 nephews. At the time, War was only a few months old, so we left him with my sister-in-law. and we took the girls. And for the most part, it was a fun trip until the end. Although Pestilence was in quite a mood. She was, I don't know what like a school field trip did to annoy her, but she was just muttering curses at them the whole time. It's like, ooh. So anyway, but I mean, it was a pretty good trip. I regret not having taken any photos, and again, it kind of ended on a sour note. I don't remember if it was Famine or Pestilence that had a bit of a temper tantrum before we left. But yeah. And finally, V is for van. Have you lived in a van? No. Have you been following Kit's van life on Kit's World? Not really. Like I watched some of his videos, and then some of them I don't. And I haven't really been keeping up with the van life videos. So that was the V tag from Jim. Next week should be the W tag, which I'm quite looking forward to, because W is for war, and that will wrap up me talking about the 4 children of the apocalypse. So anyway, BookTube, if you would like to do this tag, consider yourselves tagged, and I will see you hopefully tomorrow with a video of some sort. I'm not entirely sure what yet. But anyway, BookTube, until then, thank you, have a great afternoon, and stay safe.